Need to get my phone out. I just realized I don't have a clock back there. I need to have a talk with the deacon in charge of replacing that. That's me, if you weren't aware of that. All right. So we're talking this quarter about parables, if you haven't noticed. The parables of Christ. I'm looking through the Gospels. I seriously doubt that we cover a lot this quarter that you've never heard before. For most of us in this room, I know this is true for me, probably many of us who grew up in the church, or many who have been a Christian for a long period of time, you've probably read many of these parables before. You've probably heard sermons about many of these parables before. You've probably looked at them often, thought about them often, and studied them. The parables, they tend to be fairly foundational teachings. Usually, in most of these cases, pretty simple stories, simple teachings. So that's why I say many of us are probably very familiar with them. I will say, however, in preparation for this class, I made a list of all the parables. What have I got to work with? And there are actually a few parables that gave me some hang-up that I didn't quite understand. But luckily for all of you, Ben agreed to teach sermons on the ones that I don't understand. So I'm going to let him cover those a little bit better than I would. But that's probably going to be the case for multiple people in the room, right? There's a few parables that maybe give us some hang-up, that we don't understand as much, that we don't study as much. And we will actually talk about some of those. I won't pass them all off to Ben. We're not going to be touching on all the parables, however. There's too many. Like I said, I made a list of all the parables to see what we had to work with, and there's about 40, roughly. That number will fluctuate a little bit. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you haven't looked through the book yet, you'll notice, if you look at the table of contents, kind of the way I structured the class was, I kind of categorized the parables a little bit by theme, by topic. So we're going to talk about some similar parables each week, and that might relate to each other a little bit. We probably won't. I don't know if we will. I'm going to try to. We may not hit all the parables I have on that list. So you can see some weeks I've got one parable, some weeks we've got 4 parables. So just kind of depending on the length of them. We'll hit what we can each week. So if we don't get to the 4th parable on any given week, we might skip it and move on. We're having to skip some parables anyways, so that'll just be the way that goes. When I was first asked to teach the parables, it was, I think, earlier this year, end of last year, I can't remember the time frame. I was told, will you teach the Bible class for the adults on the parables? And my first thought was, okay, parables. Why parables? I feel like we talk about parables a lot. Like I said a minute ago, I feel like we mention the parables a lot. We study them a lot. Why talk about these things in the adult class? And actually, in the last couple of weeks, my suspicion was confirmed. The last 4 Bible classes actually referenced a parable. In each of them, Ben and Tim both mentioned parables. Just confirming my suspicion. We mention them a lot. We talk about them a lot. We use these things to teach a lot. So I didn't have this question in your book, so sorry to put you on the spot, but why do you think that it's beneficial for us to go back and talk about the parables, something that we've already studied probably many times for most of us? JD?
Well, for me, it goes back to what you said about them being foundational, not just in the church in terms of Bible study, but in any type of study, and even for those who follow, for example, those who study martial arts, they always take the time at least once or twice, or maybe multiple times over the course of their careers or lifetimes to go back to basics, go back to where they began, to their roots, so to speak, to reflect on how far they've grown from that foundation, and or to refresh in their memories those foundational elements, or even just to perhaps see if there's something they missed, or if there's something new to be gleaned from an already studied concept, for lack of a better explanation.
Yeah. Ben?
Well, you mentioned there's 40 of them. I could, I guess, preach almost an entire year just on parables. So there's quite a bit of ground to cover. The fact that Jesus taught so much in this way is a great way for us to really, reason for us to go back and think about them.
One more right back here.
They're also simplistic and not simplistic, but Jesus spoke to them sometimes in parables to make
Yeah, you guys kind of hit all of my thoughts on the head. Kind of first, I thought the same way JD did was these things are, like I said, most of these teachings are very foundational for Christians or for followers of Christ. And so it's good to go back and strengthen our foundations and talk about those things that we base our life on. Some other reasons, maybe to make correction where needed. Sometimes these simple things, or things that might seem simple to us, are easy for us to forget, to kind of pass over, because maybe we have that mindset where we don't come back and study them often. Jesus used these to teach people, so maybe we can learn some things about how to teach other people in the same way that he did. And Ben kind of mentioned this. Jesus spoke often in parables. A significant amount of his teaching was parables, so they must be important. He spent a lot of time in them. I'm not sure if you're aware, but lately there have been a lot of personal Bible studies going on. We started this new part of our website called TexasBibleStudy.com. What that is we're putting out Google ads. We're trying to get people who are interested, who are seeking the gospel, and who are seeking spiritual knowledge, and we're trying to get their attention. And we're setting up Bible studies with these people. This has been a tool for us, and we've got a lot of people responding, a lot of people seeking God's word and responding to those. I helped to get that part of the website started, but luckily for these people, other men and women have been taking on the responsibility of teaching them and actually doing these Bible studies. I haven't gotten to do one yet, but my wife Elena is one of the people who has been doing that. She's studying with a woman named Harriet, who responded to this ad, who asked for somebody to study with her about the Bible. She wanted to know more about the Bible and learn more about the Bible. So in preparation for that, Elena and I both have been talking a lot about foundational things, Bible overviews, the foundational principles that maybe this woman needs to know that she might not know. And we've spent a lot of time together studying those things, talking through those things together. And it's probably been just as beneficial for Elena and I as it was for Harriet. And I know she's learning a lot. Elena's learning a lot. I've learned a lot. We've benefited from talking about, like JD said, going back to those foundational principles because it strengthens our faith. It helps confirm the things we believe and the things that we're teaching other people so we can make sure we've got things right and that we're taking the right approach to Scripture and to the teachings of Jesus. Comment?
It seems to me like the parables is kind of a two-way deal. The earlier times they did it and keep people from understanding. Even the apostles didn't understand a lot of parables and they had asked. So today we got the old Bible and we understand more. So they help us understand things. But that wasn't the original way it started, I don't think. That's my opinion.
That is true, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. So it pays to study the basic things and to repeat those for our own faith, keeping our foundations strong. We don't become Christians and then move on to only complex philosophical things, because if we do, it can become easy to lose our way. We get distracted by the complex things, and also like JD mentioned, we lose way of those foundational things, those basic things that we should know, but sometimes we can forget. So it's really good to reinforce those and strengthen those. So these are just a few of probably many reasons why we're studying the parables this quarter. Like I said, we're going to study probably a lot of things you've seen before, but I think that's going to be good for us, and we're going to learn from those things. Like I said a minute ago, there's about 40 parables, give or take a few. The reason I say give or take a few is the line between a parable and an illustration or just a simple, example that Jesus might use is sometimes blurred. So there's a few that fall in some people's list of parables, a few that don't fall in others. That's why I say 40 is probably around the number. Trivia question for this morning. Which of the 4 Gospels does not include any parables? John. Right. The book of John doesn't have any parables, right? John, in his inspired writings, wrote other things. He wrote about other things, took a different approach to things. So we're actually not going to look at the book of John very much, if at all, this quarter. So I think we've got to start off this morning by asking the question, what is a parable? right? How do we define parables, and why did Jesus speak in parables? That's lesson number 1, so that's what we're going to get into now. Question number 1, how would you define a parable? JD.
Well, given how they're structured, like the parable of the sower or the Good Samaritan, or even the prodigal son, the way my brain defines a parable is a sort of explanatory story, as in a story that explains something. As the person stated, Jesus used parables to make divine knowledge easily receptible to mortal ears. So in my mind, telling these stories is a way of passing on that lesson through a medium they would be able to understand, a way to explain it.
Okay. Explanatory stories. I like that definition.
The Greek that is translated parable really means to lay beside. Is to lay something next to each other. And that's how I think about it, is something that I can understand maybe in physical terms is laid beside something that I can better understand in a spiritual way. And the parables, as far as what we're going to study, they're all kingdom related. It's not just any illustration, they're always related to the kingdom of some sort.
Yep. You have thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
They're stories that are true, not in that the literal details are true. You know, the story of rich man and Lazarus set aside for the richer.
Yep.
But they're true in that the themes that they impart are true. And that's why we remember them, and that's why God designed our brains to think in story. And the non-biblical stories, the secular stories that we remember and hold on to the most, are the ones that have the truest themes in them. And that's why they have persisted through the ages.
Yep. Exactly. Similar to all those thoughts, Easton's Bible Dictionary defines it as, like Stephen said, it's a comparison of earthly with heavenly things, setting those two things side by side. Here's one I thought somebody might say, because it's a common one, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's pretty commonly how people describe these things. Hugh?
These earthly stories are those that most people can relate to.
Exactly. Jesus speaks frequently in parables, like we said earlier. And when he does so, he speaks about things that are very common to people, that very common people can understand. They were relatable stories with relatable situations. Understanding the literal story that Jesus was telling wasn't the hard part. He talks about planting seeds in the ground. He talks about losing a belonging that's very important to you. These are things that the hearers at that time had probably experienced, right? They were true to life that these people probably would experience, and that's probably true for us today as well. And in saying that, it's funny that Jesus is telling these stories to these people, stories, parables. I'll use those two interchangeably this morning. He's telling these stories to people, right, in teaching. And he's doing this 2,000 years ago on the other side of the earth. But now here we are, 2022, on, again, the other side of the earth, here in the United States, and still these stories are simple. They're relatable. They're understandable. I'd be very surprised if you went this entire quarter without reading a parable and thought, wow, I've been in that situation. You probably have been in a few of these situations. Have you ever lost something important to you? That's one of the parables, or a few of them actually. These stories are timeless, right? That's the beauty of them. They're timeless. They don't alienate any group of people throughout the world or throughout time. And like I said, that's the beauty of these parables. That's why they work. That's why they're effective, because they are instantly relatable to the hearer. You can instantly place yourself in any situation that Jesus presents, and you get it. You understand what's going on, right? The earthly meaning is the easy part. I mean, even if you're not personally going out every day, planting seeds and growing fruits and vegetables, you know what that looks like. You know the basic science behind it. Dig a hole, put in a seed, cover it up, water it, give it sunlight. You understand the concept. You understand the principle behind these things. They're relatable. But then comes the hard part. What's the point? right? We can easily understand the story. We can easily understand the earthly aspect of that story, but like we said earlier, something comes next. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning or a spiritual meaning, and we've got to determine what that meaning is. That's not the easy part. That's often the hard part. There is a point to the parable being told. Anything Jesus is teaching, there's something to be learned for a disciple of Christ. And we've got to decipher what that is. Sometimes these are harder because we're likely familiar or more familiar with teaching in the other direction. What I mean by that is the Bible is full of spiritual teaching that we read, we discern, we reason through it, and then we make application to our daily life. Well, now we've got daily life applicational stories that we've got to discern and reason through the meaning to make the spiritual application, right? That direction is not as easy. With the other way, with the spiritual teachings, they tell us explicitly what to do or explicitly what not to do, right? That's easy to understand. But now when we have to look at these stories and decipher them for ourselves and determine what Jesus' point is and what he means, that can become a little more challenging. So we'd have to ask the question, why do it that way? What's the point? Why did Jesus speak in parables? If that's going to be harder for us to learn, if it would have been easier for Jesus to just given us the spiritual message from the get-go, why did he do it this way? What was the point? We're going to get to it in just a second. I'll let you answer in a minute. Turn to Matthew chapter 13. I guess we're going to get to this question here because, funny enough, Jesus' disciples have the exact same question, right? At this point in Jesus' ministry, he has told a few parables. If we look at the Gospel of Matthew, which is what we're in here, Matthew chapter 9 is the first recorded parable in Matthew. Don't you hate when technology doesn't work and it's your responsibility? So like I said, Jesus has been speaking in parables at this point in his ministry, right? This isn't the first time he has spoken in a parable. People are familiar with it. A few chapters earlier, like I said, Matthew chapter 9, we're not going to look at it, but a few men come up to Jesus and ask him, why do the Pharisees fast, but you and your disciples do not? So they ask him this question about food and eating and fasting, and Jesus responds with a story about a wedding, and then a story about patching holes in clothing, and then with a story about wine and wineskins. Can you imagine the reaction? Hey, Jesus, did you hear the question? Immediately, Jesus tells these three stories as his answer, and people must have been listening to these stories going, what is he talking about? That wasn't the question that we asked. Okay, now he finished the stories. Now he must be about to answer the question. Nope, he's walking away. He's done, right? That was how a lot of these interactions went with Jesus, was they asked him a question, he told this parable, people are waiting for the answer, and then he never gave it. At least that's how it appeared to them, that he's not answering these questions. Jesus had a lot of interactions like this. He didn't directly answer people's questions all of the time. Some people probably thought this was crazy, right? What is he doing? Some of the people closest to him, why are you teaching this way? You're turning people away. And that's why they ask him the question in Matthew 13. Jesus has just told the parable of the sower that we're very familiar with. We're going to study that next week. And immediately following that parable, his disciples come up to him and say, hey, Jesus, why are you doing it this way? What's the point of these parables? And let's go ahead and read what Jesus' response is. In Matthew 13, starting in verse 10. So the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? Jesus answered them, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, You will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, because they see, and your ears, because they hear. For truly I say to you, that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. Question number 2. What does Jesus say is his purpose for speaking in parables, according to this text? JD?
Well, translated quite literally, here, what he told to his apostles, the apostles were given the mysteries plain as day of what heaven is, of its nature, of God's nature, but the rest of the people didn't receive that. And as we said at the start of this class, these parables are a way of, making that which they were not given in a way obtainable, understandable, assuming they can decipher the meaning of the parables, the true lesson to these stories.
I think the parables are spoken because those that would hear would understand based on the heart condition they had. So if their hearts were open, they could understand. If their hearts were closed already, then they wouldn't be able to take it in. Also, it's fulfillment of prophecy, both on the hearer part and also I look later on verse 34. It's also prophecy on the part of Jesus having spoken in that way. So both sides of that equation are fulfilled in speaking the parable.
It was a way for Jesus to teach his apostles for 3 years without being before he was executed. He'd come out boldly and said right words. He could have been executed the first month he started preaching.
Yep.
Following up on what Stephen said and David, in short, it was a way to reveal the truth, and it was a way to conceal the truth to those whose hearts were not ready. And so, reveal and conceal.
Yeah. You took that phrase right out of my notes, that these were meant to both reveal and conceal the message, and we'll kind of get to what that means here in a second. But those are all great thoughts, and really to that same point, I want to focus primarily on verse 11. To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. You can see where I got the title of the class. Jesus is saying that these things it has not been granted to these other people to know the truth, to know these mysteries. Is Jesus saying that the scripture or his teachings are not meant for everyone? That there are some people who are not allowed to know what God has to say?
Well, it stood out to me that he mentioned the prophets and those who desired for so long to see and hear the things that these disciples of Jesus were now seeing and hearing. It's really a method of distinguishing those who are true seekers of Christ and the Messiah from those who are not truly seeking the Messiah that was prophesied in Scripture.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, you guys are digging straight into the next couple pages of my notes.
To him has ears, let him hear.
Yep.
He's not saying don't tell it, keep the secret. It's not hush hush, cold. Only the inner circle knows this. If you have ears to hear, then hear.
Exactly. In Mark chapter 16, at the end of his ministry, he told the apostles to go out and teach all the world. Go teach this to all creation, right? These teachings were meant for everyone. They were not for a specific group of people and not others.
The preacher at Westside is fond of saying, trying to keep the cookies down where everybody can reach it. Because you had people during that time, very few people, who were like Paul, who were very well educated. Your average person, not so much. These teachings could be understood by someone who was aristocratic and very well educated, but they could just as equally, if not even better, be understood by your average farmer, your average sheep herder, your average anybody. It kept the teachings of Jesus in these deep spiritual matters explainable and understandable for your average person, because the gospel is very simple, and it was preached so that everybody can understand it. Because the ultimate goal isn't just, here's all this great, awesome teaching that can save your soul so you won't go to hell, or all those other types of things. But I'm going to make it where you can understand it. No, it's so that everybody can be understanding. Everyone can come to an understanding of the truth and obey it.
Exactly. The teachings of Jesus were not selective, right? He's not saying, like you've all alluded to, he's not saying this is only for this group of people, or the educated people, or any specific group. It is for the one who is willing to learn it, right? So what this means is that these teachings, people who are going to understand them, that could be anyone. It could be anyone, but it won't be everyone. Not everyone is going to understand these things. The gospel is available freely to all. The teachings of Jesus at this time, he was offering to anyone who was listening. But not everything was immediately understood or immediately clear. Let me use an illustration to make this point a little clearer, maybe. I mentioned earlier that we've got a lot of Bible studies going on through the Texas Bible Study website, a lot of personal studies. These people who have responded to this form we've put out and are asking for Bible studies, they're people who have been searching on their computer for answers to Bible questions. They're searching for truth. They're filling out this form and telling us, hey, I want to learn more about the Bible. Can you help me do that? Those are the types of people who are coming to us. Do you think that these people are learning more about the Bible? Yes. These people are learning about the Bible. The people who are actually showing up to the studies, right? If they're studying. These people are learning about the Bible. Why? They want to. They're seeking it. They're asking for it. They are coming to us and saying, please give me the knowledge from the Bible that you already know.
As Stephen mentioned, they have a receptive heart, just as the people who understood these parables were having a receptive heart. Jesus didn't start out with a lot of flashbang, exciting stuff, which would attract people who may be a little shallow, but those who had this seeking heart and who had a desire and an ability to think and reason and make application.
Exactly. These people that we're studying with, or these people now that you guys are studying with now, are receptive. They have a receptive heart. They're seeking to know more. And because of that, for these people who are talking about now, who we're doing these studies with, to them it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. That's the point.
Just to wrap it up here, like it talks in the New Testament about the elect, the chosen, very specific terms that always sometimes send us sideways when we think about it the wrong way. It's up to us if we want to be in that group. And like you said, these people who are searching here, those are the people to which has been granted. They're wanting and seeking.
Exactly. To them it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom. All right, now let's flip that. Have you ever met somebody with the opposite attitude? I know I've sat down and studied with people, or I've talked to people who have had a very different attitude. I've actually heard from people, somebody has said to me before, I don't care if Jesus himself appears to me and tells me to follow him. I am not going to do it. That's rough. Have you ever been with somebody who has that attitude? Maybe not in those exact words, but something similar. Like, I refuse to do this. I see what you're saying, or I see what you're trying to say, but I don't want it. I reject it. That's a difficult attitude to combat. That is not a receptive heart. They are immediately rejecting it. Do you think that person is going to learn more about the truth? No. Why? Closed mind. Because they said no. They chose not to. They're rejecting it. To that person, it has not been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Stephen?
You know, what I see oftentimes is it's not an on or off once said, all done. It could be even ourselves, if we ever close our minds, and that choice has to be made every day, that we're going to remain open, stay receptive to the truth. I think oftentimes what we find in the studies that we have with people is they may be open at the beginning, but then they close that door whenever it challenges them in some way.
Exactly.
I think just to piggyback on what Stephen said, you can also have the reverse. Somebody who is not willing to listen and study, and through your example of for constant teaching, that person can be more receptive. So we don't just close the Bible just because somebody says they don't want to listen. You just continue to be that light for whoever it is, and hopefully someday that they come to the knowledge of truth.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not a binary system. You know, it's not a 1 or a 0. It's not on or off. You can switch back and forth, and any of us could. Any of us are at risk. Jesus is teaching that those who are willing to listen at any point will be able to learn and seek the truth. And this is why the parables were not immediately understood to everyone. You had to think about it. It took some effort on the part of the hearer. You know, and also, kind of moving forward, we've got something else interesting in chapter 13. Similar, but a little bit different. Like I said, right before this text that we just read, Jesus just told the parable of the sower. Okay, so he just told a parable. That's what we're talking about. Then you have this part where they ask him, why are you teaching in parables? He answers that question. And then right after this, what does he do? He explains what the parable of the sower meant. Now, that's not something Jesus did very often. There were very few of the parables that Jesus came right after and said, hey, here's what that meant. Here's what the explanation for that was. Why do you think that the disciples here got an explanation?
They didn't understand.
They asked for it. They came to Jesus and asked, we don't understand. We want to know more. Why are you teaching this way? What did that mean? Because they were seeking, because they asked, that's why they got the explanation. Because we have countless examples, and we'll see more this quarter, of people listening to a parable or listening to a teaching and going, that didn't make any sense. And they turn and they walk away. And they left. They didn't ask. They didn't continue seeking. And because of that, they remained in their ignorance. And they left not knowing the truth.
I think also when you think back to Mark, you know, that passage Mark 4:13, do you not understand this? How are you going to understand all the parables? It's almost like, let me give you a key at least.
Yeah.
Let me give you a clue as to how this works. You know,
Exactly.
You need to have something explained so they get it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's that explanation. One, here's what that meant. But two, he's also saying, I'm going to keep doing this. These parables aren't going to stop just because you seem a little confused. I'm going to keep teaching this way, so pay attention. And we're going to get to that in a minute. Jesus was not hiding his message from anyone. He was seeking people who were willing to seek him and to seek the truth that he was speaking. He was not hiding anything from anyone. That's why the phrase a minute ago, revealing and concealing, it revealed this to the people who were willing to dig in and look for it, but it was concealed from those who rejected it, who were walking away and not willing to look more into it. Yeah.
That explanation, though, wasn't to everybody. That was just to the disciples. Once they were separate, Mark talks about that, just like he was saying. It's after they got pulled away. So this was not a public explanation. You know, this was just a little bit of insight to those disciples that were closest to him.
Yeah.
Insight to them.
It was the people who stuck around. Right.
He's kind of revealing slowly to them and giving them some insight.
Exactly. So this conversation that we've been reading in Matthew 13, there's a parallel text in Luke chapter 8 I want to look at. So if you'll turn over to Luke chapter 8, you'll see this again. You'll see this multiple times throughout this quarter, where Jesus talks about one thing and we have an account of it in one gospel, and then we turn to a different and we've got the same account, right, told from a different perspective. And that's what I think we see here in Luke chapter 8, is this exact same conversation, just told from Luke's perspective, but Luke adds a little bit extra to it at the end that I want to look at now. Let me get there too. In Luke chapter 8, let's read just verse 16 through 18. And I think this is, like I said, following just after his explanation of why he speaks in parables. He adds this in the Luke account. In verse 16 of chapter 8, "Now no one, after lighting a lamp, covers it with a container, or puts it under a bed, but he puts it on a lampstand, so that those who come in may see the light. For nothing is hidden that will not become evident, nor anything secret that will not be known and come to light. So take care how you listen. For whoever has, to him more shall be given. Whoever does not have, even what he thinks he has, shall be taken away from him." What's the takeaway from these verses? What is Jesus adding to this conversation here?
To the one that has a good and honest heart, the one that has an open and receptive mind, understanding will be given. And to those that don't, that have a closed mind, they're most likely going to be drifting further away from what the true meaning of that is.
So I think in verse 16, it's interesting. He's almost talking to himself. So he's giving this parable. And then in verse 16, he's saying, hey, I'm not going to put this under a bushel. I've made this known. It's available to people. What he's speaking to, I think, in Luke is more of the positive side of the revealing. It's available, but it goes to the heart of that person again. That's where they take advantage of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think what Richard said is kind of towards the end in verse 18, but I think 16 and 17 is what Stu is talking about, right? He's talking kind of about the teacher and the purpose of the teacher and the purpose of the teaching. Consider this thought. What if next Sunday I came into class and I set my goal to make all of my points, all of my thoughts, all of the things that I said as confusing as possible so that none of you had a clue what I was talking about? Do you think you'd benefit from Bible class next week? No.
Be entertaining.
It might be entertaining. It would probably be my last Bible class to teach, for sure. But what would be the point of that, right? What benefit would that be to any of you if I were to take that approach with you? None, right? You would get nothing out of that. No one lights a light just to cover it and place it out of sight. Anyone who lights a light puts it on a lampstand for anyone to see. No one teaches, at least not a good teacher, with the goal of making sure no one understands, right? There's no benefit to that. There's no purpose to that. No one's going to do that. That's what Jesus is saying, if they're a good teacher and if their head's on straight. There's no benefit from purposefully hiding this message from anyone. Jesus says that's not what he's doing, right? He's talking for a second about himself, making sure they know why he's doing it. I'm not trying to turn people away. My goal is not to make people leave without understanding. It's to do all of the things that we've talked about already. It's to get people to pay attention. Because now, turn to the hearer, like what Richard was saying in verse 18. The point here is take care how you listen. Verse 18. Take care how you listen. Pay attention. Listen carefully. That's Jesus' point. I'm not trying to hide this from you. I just expect you to listen to me and to think about it. Give it a little bit of critical thought, and maybe you'll come to the understanding that I'm trying to get across to you. Jesus is saying, I'm not trying to purposefully hide this. I'm just trying to get you to work for it. I want you to want to seek me, is what Jesus is saying. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of Christ, it's going to take some effort. The true meaning of the teachings is not just going to be handed to us on a silver platter. Not all the time. sometimes we've got to put in some work to make sure we understand it, to make sure that we reason through what Jesus is trying to say.
Yeah, think about this. Take heed how you hear also applies to how we're hearing with regard to the authoritative nature of what Jesus is expressing. The Pharisees listened very carefully to entrap him.
Exactly.
So they were listening with care, but it wasn't the right kind of care.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful we're not that way.
Yeah, don't take care to listen, take care how you listen, right? With what kind of heart you have, whether it's receptive or not.
It's also more interesting to listen to a person who challenges the students to think. It's just like it's more interesting to have a song leader that challenges us to sing better. So for a student of the Word, having someone that challenges them, that would encourage the real student to listen more.
Exactly. What's often the outcome from a teacher who challenges their student? They go home and study, and ultimately, they learn more, right? You learn more when you do it yourself, right? When you prepare things yourself, I gain more out of teaching Bible class than I do sitting in the auditorium listening to Bible class. I'm sure that's true for anyone else in here who teaches in any capacity. You gain more from it by preparing, spending time in it, thinking about it, and dwelling on it for longer. As was mentioned a minute ago, kind of bringing us to question 4, Jesus often finishes a parable or teaching with this statement: "He that hath ears," or he who has ears to hear, let him hear. What does that mean?
So we see in Matthew, Matthew's making in Matthew 13 particularly, a pretty good effort to tie Jesus' ministry back to Isaiah. He quotes like Isaiah 6, where we have Isaiah's commission. And Isaiah is basically told, yeah, these people have ears, they have eyes, but they're not going to see, they're not going to hear, they're not going to understand until it's too late. And then kind of we see an example of that in the right after this in chapter 7 of Isaiah, where Isaiah tells King Ahaz, you're being attacked by Israel and Aram. All you need to do is trust God. And God will even give you a sign, whatever you want, to help you trust him. But Ahaz says, not interested. And we see Ahaz goes and hires the king of Assyria, and that brings them more trouble and kind of starts in motion some of the things that lead to their destruction. So I mean, this he who has ears, let him hear, is a warning to pay attention. Don't be like the people in Isaiah's day who didn't pay attention and were ultimately destroyed.
Yeah, it's a further warning to pay attention to the things that were just said. Show of hands. Who in this room has ears? I have 2. If you didn't raise your hand, you probably weren't listening, right? You didn't hear the question. We've all got ears, right? Everybody has ears. And Jesus says, if you have ears, use them. If you don't use them, I've got Peter over here. He might just come cut them off. That was a Matthew chapter 26 joke, if you didn't get it. Ears come in all shapes and sizes, right? I'm not just talking about this physical cartilage on the side of your head, right? It's not about the physical ears. I think ears might change depending on the situation, right? If you're sitting here in this auditorium right now and you're listening to the things I have to say, or maybe you're listening to Ben, or we have a guest speaker this morning who's going to preach for us, Jesse. If you're listening to the sermon or the teaching, you're using your ears, right? If you're sitting down silently with your Bible, looking at the words, processing them in your head, thinking through them and dwelling on them, you're using your ears. To somebody who might be blind or deaf, who's feeling braille on a piece of paper, to take in the words and understand the meaning of the message, they are using their ears, right? The ears are not physical. The ears are much more than the physical things on the side of your head. It's about that receptive heart. It's about whether you're willing to use the mind and the brain that God gave you to take in something, to do more than just hear that something's being spoken, but to listen to it and to heed what it has to say. Albert Barnes, in his commentary, explains it like this. He says, this statement is an expression implying that it is every man's duty present to pay attention to what was spoken. Right? Every single person in the room has the responsibility to listen, to pay attention, to think about what's being said, and to ultimately seek the truth for better understanding. Yep.
I think one of the other keys to that is actually a couple of verses further down in chapter 8, verse 19, when Jesus' mother and brothers had come to him. But Jesus said in verse 21, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God. And it doesn't end there. He says it's those who hear the word of God and do it. The do matters.
Yep.
I can take in everything that you're saying in class or what Ben preaches or what I might hear guest speakers say. I can hear it. I can pay attention. I can sit up. I can take notes. I can do all of those things. But the do matters.
Exactly.
It matters. It's the application. It's the doing.
Yep.
Not just the hearing and taking it in and understanding.
Yeah, that's part of the listening, is understanding what was said and understanding that in most of these cases, all of these cases, Jesus is expecting a follow-up, something to take place in their lives based on what he was teaching. Jesus says, I'm telling you these things, that the things you need to know. All you got to do is just listen to them. Pay attention. Take care to how you listen. The people who rejected Jesus and rejected his teachings, whose fault was it? Was it theirs, or was it Jesus's for not making the teaching clearer? It was theirs. Jesus said, I'm making it as clear as I can. If you're thinking about it, if you're paying attention, it's here. The people who rejected him were not listening. All right, we're out of time. I'm going to skip a couple of our questions here. So I'll end with this. Ultimately, for us, which type of person are we going to be? Is it granted to us to know the mysteries of the kingdom, or is it not granted? Are we going to listen and take heed or not? We're going to listen, right? That's what we're doing this quarter. That's what we're going to be doing with these parables, is listening, thinking through them. We will be careful how we listen to them, and we will be looking for the meaning of these parables. That's why Jesus spoke in parables, to get us to pay attention and to think through them and to give it all of our heart. We'll continue next week with Lesson 2, Parable of the Sower. Thank you for listening.